In this lecture, we're going to talk about Neo-Analytic Approaches. The Neo-Analytic Approaches are a collection of theories and psychoanalytic approaches that followed from the work of Sigmund Freud. Each of the individuals who contribute to these Neo-Analytic approaches were at one time followers of Freudian psychoanalysis. For one reason or another, these individuals found differentiations in their understanding of the human psyche and looked to expand Freud's theory. Now, as we learned when we talked about Sigmund Freud in psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud was very rejecting of change. He believed that his view of the theory, as he conceptualized it, was complete. And so anyone who sought to change or deviate from his approach was seen as an individual who was a dissenter. And so these approaches stem from the new discoveries and advances made by his initial followers. In sum, the neo-analytic approaches look to de-emphasize sexuality and also de-emphasize the importance of the unconscious. The primary focus of these approaches was on human development, in particular, the ego development and how it functions in human relations. The overall focus of these neo-analytic approaches is the ego. In describing the structure of the mind, Freud divided it into three components: the id, the ego, and the superego. The neo-analytic theorists focus primarily on the ego. They see the ego as being the core of an individual's personality. It is the ego and its subsequent development that determines how individuals are able to confront the challenges they face in the world and form lasting connections with their social and familial circles. Under this approach, on focusing with the ego, individuals do not have free will to make choices. It is believed that your ego is set at birth, and so your destiny is predetermined. More recent applications of the neo-analytic school of thought have this concept open to interpretation, meaning they're willing to reconsider and see that yes, individuals do have some choice. We'll discuss at a later time some more current approaches that look at choice theory and how individuals can shape the course of their development. So why move away from Freud? Some fundamental concepts. In addition to de-emphasizing sexuality and the unconscious, the neo-analytic theorists believe that identity development is not formed in those first 5 to 6 years of life. In Freud's stage theory, he talks about your development through the oral, anal, and latency stages as being key components of your personality development. For his neo-analytic counterparts, there's a combination. There is the predetermined component that is present at birth, and then there's also the belief that your identity development, particularly your adult identity, continues beyond childhood. That continued development is a result of social and cultural forces. The environment in which we grow up and are raised, the individuals we come in contact who play important roles in our lives, all shape who we are and how we develop. Additionally, these neo-analytic approaches take a more positive spin. In Freudian psychoanalysis, there is a much more negative connotation on human development. Freud talked a lot about fixations and regressions, dealing with the problems people have in normal development. In the neo-analytic approaches, less attention is paid to these fixations and regressions, and more is paid on the coping skills and strategies that people develop to overcome the problems in their lives. Now, these neo-analytic theories are actually a collection of individual theories that all seem to work well together or share commonalities. In particular, we're going to briefly look at 4 neo-analytic approaches. These 4 are ego psychology, object relations psychology, analytic psychology, and psychosocial stage development, or Erik Erikson's work. The first one we'll look at is ego psychology. Ego psychology is the brainchild of Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna Freud. Anna Freud was born in 1895, and she was the youngest of Sigmund Freud's 6 children. She was in the 2nd grade of her primary school when Freud began publishing his interpretation of dreams, which outlined the basis and fundamental tenets of his theory. As a child, she was constantly looking up to her older sister, following in her every footsteps. When her older sister married and moved away, Anna began closely following her father. In fact, Anna was one of the first psychoanalysis patients of Sigmund Freud. When she was 15 years old, she consented to participating in psychoanalytic practice sessions, which helped further cement Freud's theory. Her work with her father eventually led to her following in his professional footsteps, becoming a psychoanalyst and then developing as a therapist and psychologist in her own right. In general, her approach shares many of the same premises as her father's. Of the neo-analytic approaches we talk about, hers does not differ nearly as much as some of the others. The primary difference here is how she conceptualizes the ego concept. In traditional psychoanalysis, Freud viewed the ego as having more of a mediator role. Its purpose was to mediate between the id, the superego, and the outside world. The ego made sure that we stayed balanced, that we didn't completely succumb to impulses and biological urges, and that we were not completely overrun by overly moralistic thinking and virtue. For Anna Freud, she saw this as being a little bit more. She saw the ego as also being related to adaptation. How we as individuals are able to adapt and change as society and the world changes around us. To this end, she greatly expanded the ego concept. In Anna Freud's theory, the ego develops independently from the id. Previous understandings was that the ego developed out of the id as a way of self-control and self-reform. In this new conceptualization, it's a completely separate part of the mind. So much so that it has its own psychic energy. It's able to fuel itself. If you recall, when we talk about Freudian psychoanalysis, the energy that fueled the different components of the mind was known as the libido. And that energy was shared. When it was localized in one component, such as the id, the others, the ego and the superego, were left without. And so functioning depended largely on where that psychic energy resided. In Anna Freud's conceptualization, the id and the ego had their own psychic energy. They each could be fully fueled at any given moment. When that situation arose, ego conflict is what developed. A third component is this idea of ego autonomy. Ego autonomy claims that the ego has separate functions from the id. Previously, the ego was seen as being completely dependent on the id. The ego essentially served the role as mediator and impulse control regulator, meaning the id had to be actualized and energized by the libido energy for the ego to have anything to worry about. In this conceptualization, the ego has its own functions as well. It also plays a role in psychic functions and thought processes that are not related to impulse control, such as your memory, your motor coordination, or reality testing. Because it has its own separate energy and has its own separate functions, it's largely free of any conflict produced by the id. In other words, it's no longer seen as just being the babysitter or the caretaker for the id. And so in treatment, our goal is to try to expand our conflict-free zone. The more areas we have in which the id does not creep in and influence or impact us, the more psychologically healthy we'll be. By increasing the ego's autonomy and the different spheres that it controls, individuals are able to better relate to the world around them and make positive decisions. How does this all relate to our personality? By focusing more on the dynamics of the ego rather than the structure of the ego, there is a de-emphasis on biological forces. Seeing that your ego can be changed or altered by your environment and your relationships lends more credence to the nurture side of the nature-nurture debate. By emphasizing social and psychological forces, it opens up our understanding that personality is fluid and external in nature. And then finally, there was a minimized importance on infantile sexuality and the development of the Oedipus complex. Again, less of a focus on sexuality than was in psychoanalysis. And as a result, your early decisions and developmental challenges in life were more on socialization than they were on sexual development. Anna Freud was also instrumental in helping to expand our understanding of defense mechanisms. Like her father, she saw defense mechanisms as being a subconscious way for our mind to protect itself from the harsh realities of life. These defense mechanisms were automatically triggered and activated to help take troubling situations and make them more palatable for us so that we could rationalize and understand the world around us without it harming us. Some of the different defense mechanisms that Anna Freud talked about: denial, identification with the aggressor, in which the adage that if you can't beat them, join them applies. In this situation, our defense mechanism is that if we cannot overcome a troubling situation or individual, we try to identify with and be more like that person. Join them. Asceticism, which is an abstinence from pleasure, a form of self-punishment in which we remove any pleasurable activities or situations in our life. Altruistic surrender, giving up your point of view. Turning against the self, again another form of self-punishment in which we begin to look down upon or chastise our originally held beliefs. Reversal, isolation, and undoing. Going back, a mental activity in which we try to undo the emotional ties that we have with an individual or an activity. Examples would be in relationships that discontinue. You may get rid of any pictures you have or remove someone from your phone directory. You go back and you undo the connection you had. And so these defense mechanisms were great ways to help our ego develop in a safer environment. Now let's turn our attention to another approach, the object relations theory. There is not a single individual that we could relate the object relations approach to. Many psychoanalysts contributed to this approach. One of the first to do so was Otto Rank. Otto Rank was one of Freud's proteges who worked with him in his early years. Rank's ideas lead to some of our current understandings of object relations theory. These ideas were further enhanced by many others, notably Melanie Klein, who was working in London at the time. According to the object relation theorists, our focus here is on interpersonal relationships. In particular, how we internalize external objects. Central to this theory is the understanding of what we mean by the term objects. An object is seen as that which satisfies a need or the person who is the focus of one's feelings and drives. It's the subject that's determining how we are feeling, thinking, and acting at a given moment. For example, if you have a test coming up and it's causing you anxiety, worrying about how you'll do in the class, causing you to rearrange your schedule so that you could devote more time to studying and preparation. In this example, the test is the object, for it is the subject that's motivating everything else. Objects can be external or internal. It could be something tangible, a test that's coming up. It could be something internal, a belief or a feeling you have. Perhaps you will soon be turning 40 and you start to have these existential crises, wondering where you're going in your life and whether your life has meaning. These thoughts cause you to go out and make drastic changes in your life. You buy a new car. You quit your job and get a new career. The internal object here is the feelings that you have about purpose and completeness in life. Traditionally, and early in life, our object, our primary object, is a parent or guardian. Now again, if we think back to the time when these theories were developed, that probably was your mother. Your mother was the object from which all of your needs were met. As a small child, when you're hungry, need attention, need changing, you cry out for your mother, and your mother is the one who brings these things for you and satisfies your need. In this perspective, objects are sources of pleasure. They're not seen as human beings who have their own needs and desires. A small baby just sees mom as the person who feeds me. That child does not yet conceptualize or understand that mom is a human being as well, who has her own needs, wants, and desires. Mom is not on call 24 hours a day just to satisfy baby's needs. These objects can be part objects or whole objects. A part object is when it's just a part or component of a figure that brings the satisfaction or pleasure. So maybe it's the mother's hand or that warm touch that soothes the baby. Whereas the whole object is the entire focus. So mom as an entire person. Object-relation theory also talks about defense mechanisms, but there are much fewer than there are in other approaches. Here, the defense mechanisms not only protect you, but they also protect your attachment to the object. Why that's important to you. As small children, you may have had a pillow or blanket that was very important to you. That safety blanket was a sense of security for you. When people tried to take it from you, you most likely relied on some defense mechanisms to help rationalize why you needed it and how it was important for you. Some of the defense mechanisms that object relation theorists talk about are projection, introjection, splitting, and projective identification. How does this approach work? In theory, healthy people, or those with few problems dealing with ego development, have good object relations and a strong sense of self. Being able to differentiate self from others is important. Carrying on with our case study, Small children, as they grow, eventually start to differentiate from their primary caregiver, their mother. They no longer become completely dependent on mom for all of their needs. They're now able to go to the bathroom on their own, feed themselves, they could walk, they could talk. As your sense of self and individuality develops, how does that change your object relations? Now that mom is no longer your only source of nourishment or attention, how do you relate to your mom? Healthy people also begin to see objects as not good or bad. It's not a black or white dichotomy. Instead, there are multiple shades of gray in between. Objects can change their evaluative property as the situation dictates. You love your mother. Your mother is a source of comfort. But when your mom punishes you, she may not hold that same rank at that moment. You may not see your mom in such a loving manner at that moment. Instead, you have a more negative interpretation because now she is not the source of satisfaction or pleasure. It's quite opposite. She's now the source of pain or frustration. On the opposite end, unhealthy people are those individuals who have difficulty with identity diffusion, being able to separate, being able to see objects in their proper context. Things are not always black or white. Your mom or your parent does not always have to give in to what you want. Sometimes they do have to say no, and that's part of growing up and maturing. A third approach we'll look at is analytic psychology. Analytic psychology is the work of Carl Jung. Jung was another one of the early proteges of Sigmund Freud. Upon reading Freud's interpretation of dreams, he became fascinated in the psychoanalytic approach and actually began writing to Freud to learn more about what he was talking about. Eventually, they had a chance to meet in person, and their first meeting lasted 12 hours. Freud took an immediate liking to Jung and saw him as someone who shared in his ideas and values. They began a collaborative professional relationship, and actually they lectured together at Clark University in Atlanta, which was Sigmund Freud's first and only visit to the United States. The respect Freud had for Jung was so great that he appointed Jung as the first president of his International Psychoanalysis Association. Unfortunately, this great friendship and professional admiration soon came to an end. Although they worked closely together, Carl Jung had some differing opinions about the theory. Jung believed that there was more to the unconscious mind than what Freud thought or what he talked about. Freud disagreed, and that disagreement led to a public confrontation in which Carl Jung was stripped of his presidency and eventually left to form his own organization. Part of his goal was to develop his own theory. In Jung's mind, he wanted to expand the understanding of the ego development. And so he focused on changes that occur at midlife as well, no longer seeing personality development and ego development as strictly occurring during childhood and early adolescence. In addition, he saw that humans were motivated by past and the future. Whereas Freud believed that your past determined who you are, Jung took it a step further and saw that the future also plays a role. Knowing where we would like to go in the future allows us the opportunity to change and develop. And like some of the other neo-analytic approaches, there was less of a focus on sexual identity and development than Freud talked about. Illustrating the connection between the theories, Jung viewed the energy, that motivating force that guided our psyche, as a libido, much like Freud did. Only here, the libido that Jung talks about was generalized life energy and not sexual energy. It was not purely designed to foster the aggression or sex drive. It was a source of daily living energy. And that energy is expressed in all that we do. Not only just our growth and reproduction, but also our positive activities with others. How we connect to and relate to other people. The central concept of Jung's theory is that of the collective unconsciousness. The collective unconsciousness becomes the roadmap or the blueprint that explains who we are as individuals. Now, this collective consciousness is unknown to the person. It exists at a truly deep level in your mind. It is not something that you have direct awareness of happening, developing, or occurring. That collective unconsciousness is the group or cumulative experiences of past generations. So it's not only your experiences, but it's the experiences of your ancestors and how they influence who you are. To better understand this concept, think of some of the customs or traditions or values that you have that you learned from your parents. Where did those come from? Generations before them have passed these down. We also have certain personality aspects that seem to run in our families. We could be altruistic families, hardworking families, extroverted, introverted. All of this collections come together. These personal experiences merge together with a set of universal evolutionary experiences. Experiences that everyone deals with, regardless of their personal background or family history. While our personal backgrounds may shape our understanding of these universal experiences, they do form a significant part of who we are. And And so all of these experiences, all this collection put together, forms the basis of our personality. And personality, according to Jung, was seen as an archetype. What type of person are you? There are different archetypes that are based on collections of experiences. If you had to describe yourself to others, what type of person would you describe? Or if you had to explain or describe the type of person you view as an ideal mate for you, what's the archetype you would describe? What are the characteristics that you would look for in another person? And so this archetype sets the stage for who we are and how we encounter the world around us. As I mentioned earlier, Jung believes that your past and your future shape who you are. Your archetype is made up of elements in your past, but it also can change throughout life. Things that happen in the future can change how you see yourself. Maybe you experience some eye-opening event, or you have some epiphany or revelation later in life that changes how you view yourself and the world around you. In Jung's theory, this can be accounted for because you can change and develop. In fact, your self-actualization, how you view yourself and your place in the world, should keep changing. How we display or share with others our archetype depends on the situations that we're in. At times, we may resort to using what's called personas or shadows. A persona is the archetype we want to project. It's how we want others to view us. It may not necessarily be who we actually are. In a sense, it's like putting on a mask and disguising yourself, hiding from others the aspects of your personality that you wish them not to see, and only showing what you want them to see. You can think of politicians during an election season. Some may argue that what they say and how they present is a persona. They're projecting how they want you to see them, when in reality that may not be who they truly are. It's that true self that gets pushed back to a shadow. We hide or conceal that because we're afraid others will look negatively upon it and not value us as much. And so as we become more self-actualized and our personality and our ego develops, there is some utility in that. Our personality and ego helps us to think, feel, sense, and understand or interpret the world intuitively. These all have adaptive value. They all help us to better function in the world around us. Now, Jung's work is still widely practiced today, and what does it look like in session? Well, therapists using the Analytic Psychology or the Jungian approach would try to get a confession from the individual. Now, confession is not, as we interpret the word, it's not a admission of guilt. Rather, it's talking about their narrative personal history. sharing who they are, where they come from, getting all the information out on the table. Once that information is out, we could proceed to the elucidation stage. It is here that the therapist works with the client to start interpreting transferences. How might these have developed, and how might they be influencing personality and relationships for that individual? Once we've talked about these transference relationships, we can begin the education stage. Here, the therapist helps the client start translating insight into action. While it's all well and good to learn more about who you are and why you may be that way, now we need to take action. Change the undesirable parts. And so together, the therapist and client engage in a stage of transformation where the client's ultimate self-actualization is pursued. The final theory I want to talk about is psychosocial development. This is the work of Erik Erikson. Erikson, again, another contemporary of Sigmund Freud, built on Freud's ideas in the psychoanalytic approach by adding a dimension. His addition talked about how we see our place in the world we live in each day. In other words, how do we interact with the world around us? Like Freud, he saw this development occurring in stages. There are certain differences between the stage approaches of Freud and Erikson. And these are important to note. For Freud, development was more sexual oriented, whereas for Erikson, development was more social oriented. For Freud, development was largely completed by puberty or adolescence. Erikson saw development as a lifelong endeavor. Freud believed that people could become fixated in a stage and would need to regress back to earlier stages. Erikson saw no need for fixations or regressions. Individuals could move on to the next stage even if they had not successfully mastered the developmental challenges of a previous stage. One was not based on the other. In developing his stage approach, some assumptions Erikson was playing on. One is the belief that people have the same basic needs. Regardless of our background, who we are, where we come from, we all have the same basic needs. All individuals want to feel loved and connected. And we all need food, clothing, shelter, water. Because we have these same basic needs, there really is a lot more in common amongst us than we often give credit to. Our individual personalities develop in response to these needs. What it is we need helps shape who we are. While we all have the same needs, we all have different and varying levels of need. A child who grows up in a single-parent home with limited funding may have a very different expression of need for food or clothing than a child who grows up in a very affluent family with unlimited resources. You still need these objects, but the understanding and realization of how quickly they'll come and the quality of which they'll be is much different. Our development as individuals occurs in these stages. And the stages are based on different motivations in our lives. At different points of our lives, we have a different motivation. That which is most important to us. If you were to think back to when you were 7 years old, what was the most important thing in life at that time? Now, fast forward to you're 15 years old. What is most important in your life? Is it the same thing as when you were 7? Probably not. Now fast forward to your current age. What is most important to you in life now? Is it the same thing as it was when you were 15? Probably not. And so we go through these stages where motivation differs depending on what's most important to us at that time. In each of these stages, there's a challenge that individuals must successfully overcome. These challenges could lead to a crisis. A crisis occurs when individuals face a challenge and believe that it exceeds their coping skills. In other words, they do not believe that they have what it takes to get past. We've all experienced these in life. At the time, they seem insurmountable. But eventually we get through them. How we get through it and our evaluation of that process, whether it's positive or negative, contributes to our personality. If we have more positive resolutions of crises in our life than negative resolutions, we tend to have a more positive personality or positive outlook. We see life as challenging, but we also see ourselves as being capable of rising to the occasion and overcoming these challenges. Those individuals who have more negative outcomes than positive see the world as this daunting place that's unpredictable and unrelenting. And ultimate success is very challenging. So if we take a look at the stages that Erikson talks about, we could see how we develop throughout life. Now again, each of these stages has a major milestone or a challenge that must be overcome. Should that challenge not be successfully managed, individuals still move on to the next stage. That area of incomplete business may be the source of something that you talk about in a therapy session with clients, but it does not preclude them from growing any further. Like Freud, there are some age ranges associated with these stages, but again, those are purely guide markers and should not be seen as absolutes. In the first stage, our developmental challenge is trust versus mistrust. This is in infancy or birth to 18 months. Here, the important event is feeding or nourishment. Children develop a sense of trust when they are reliably provided for. A child is hungry, it cries out, and mother is quickly there to provide a bottle or feed the child. The child develops a sense of trust, knowing that I will be taken care of. People are there to help me. When the opposite is true, and the child may go without sometimes, mistrust develops. The child is not able to reliably count on anyone to help them in a time of need. In the second stage, the early childhood stage, from 2 to 3 years, we have a challenge of autonomy versus self-doubt. Here the important event is toilet training. Toilet training is a pivotal developmental milestone for children. Those that are able to successfully conquer this develop a sense of independence, that they can control their own physical bodies. This sense of independence leads to feelings of autonomy. Children who struggle feel shame and self-doubt. Why can't I do this? What's wrong with me? In stage 3, we have initiative versus guilt. And this is the preschool years, ages 3 to 5. The key developmental event here is exploration. Children begin walking and talking and exploring the world around them. Success leads to a sense of purpose. Failure leads to a sense of guilt. Children who are punished for being too inquisitive or getting into too many situations may feel guilt that they're not supposed to go out and inspect the world around them. The next stage, the school age stage, ages 6 to 11, is industry versus inferiority. This is when children begin going to school. In going to school, the world opens up. They must now deal with new social and academic demands. Not only are they at home with mom and dad or family, but now they interact with other children, other adults and teachers. Those who are able to successfully adapt to the school environment develop a sense of competence. Those that don't begin to feel inferior. Why are others able to do it, but I can't? The next stage is identity versus role confusion. These are your adolescent years, 12 to 18. As we begin forming social relationships with others, we try to address the question of who we are. How do we want to identify ourselves? You think back to your high school days, there were probably many different cliques or groups. How does an individual decide which one they relate to? Developing a sense of identity allows you to feel comfortable in your own skin and be true to yourself. Role confusion results in a state where you never truly feel like you fit in or belong, and always see yourself as the outsider. Moving into young adulthood, the challenge becomes intimacy versus isolation. Forming relationships, finding a life partner with who you will continue growing with. Those who struggle in this developmental stage have feelings of isolation or loneliness. that they're alone in the world and there's nobody there for them. Where Freud's theory leaves off, Erikson's continues, and we can move to middle age, 40 to 65 years, and a period of generativity versus stagnation. Here, individuals become concerned with legacy, looking to see that the goal should be to create and nurture things that will outlast them. In particular, having children and working to raise and develop children. Successfully getting past this stage leads to feelings of usefulness and accomplishment, whereas failure is associated with shallow involvement in the world, only looking out for yourself and no one else. And finally, we have a stage of integrity versus despair. Later in life, ages 65 and up, where you start to reflect on your life, looking back on all that you've accomplished. If you look back and feel a sense of fulfillment, this is a successful management of this developmental challenge. Those who don't look back and see despair and have regrets or bitterness for missed opportunities, risks not taken. At the end of your life, you should look back and feel that you did all that you could, not that you left stones unturned or cards on the table. So how does this relate in a counseling setting? In working with clients, we try to understand how the major developmental tasks are reflected in client issues. Whether there's a successful or failed attempt at addressing previous developmental challenges, that event influences a client's personality. And so we may look for themes. Are there consistent patterns or themes that appear throughout a child, into adolescent, into adulthood? We look at relatedness, current concerns. How do they relate to previous events? Is what you're struggling with now a result of you failing to do so at a previous age? And what are the choices you make? Helping individuals see that A, they have a choice, B, that choices come with consequences, and then evaluating and choosing the best course of action. So this collection of theories represents what we call the Neo-Analytic school of thought. They, more than traditional psychoanalysis, are used in contemporary counseling practices. They all base their foundation on the works of Sigmund Freud, but expand in key areas and take a different focus in others. In the coming weeks, we'll talk about Alfred Adler and his individual psychology. Adler is considered another neo-analytic approach, as he too was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud. But his theory is much more involved and is certainly shifted into an approach today that looks at much more than ego and personality development. And so we will look at that one in a lecture unto itself.